A parking ticket, $12, issued by a meter maid who never knew a name, filed in a municipal database that no detective in 8 states had thought to check. That $12 piece of paper is the reason a man who killed across half the country is sitting in prison right now. That is what I am talking about today. Not the killer's cleverness, not some criminal mastermind outwitting the FBI. The system failed. It failed for years. It failed across jurisdictions, across databases, across agencies that should have been talking to each other. And when it finally caught him, it wasn't because investigators cracked a code or found a hidden witness. It was because one database matched one record from a parking enforcement officer doing her job. That matching should have happened years earlier. I'm Danny Cruz. I spent years at the Miami Herald and Tampa Bay Times, covering crime, corruption, and the gap between what law enforcement says it does and what it actually does when the pressure is on and the victims are invisible. I've read thousands of pages of FBI internal reports, case summaries, and investigative task force documents. I've interviewed agents, detectives, and families who waited years for answers. What I'm walking you through today is documented. The FBI's Highway Serial Killings Initiative, the real structural failures that allowed highway predators to operate for years across state lines, and the specific mechanism that finally stopped one of them. If this is your first time here, subscribe before we go further. This channel does not speculate. Everything I cover has a paper trail. This story has a very long and very specific paper trail. The FBI launched the Highway Serial Killings Initiative in 2004. The Bureau identified a real and documented pattern. Long-haul truckers had appeared as suspects in an unusually high number of unsolved murders spread across the United States. Not because truckers as a profession are violent, the vast majority are not, but because the structure of long-haul trucking creates conditions that are uniquely exploitable by someone with intent to harm and a need to disappear. Think about what a long-haul route actually looks like in practice. A driver crosses state lines multiple times per week. They stop in dozens of jurisdictions over the course of a single run. They interact with dozens of people, fuel station attendants, truck stop workers, hitchhikers, and vulnerable people living on the margins at rest stops and highway corridors. They pull into a stop at 11 at night and pull out at 2 in the morning, and then they drive away. They are in the next state before anyone realizes something happened. That is not a theory. That is the documented operational pattern the FBI codified into the HSKI program. The Bureau assigned dedicated analysts to cross-reference case data from local law enforcement agencies across the country. They were looking for connections that individual departments could never see on their own. A body found near a rest stop in Texas, a missing person reported in Ohio, a last known sighting in a Tennessee truck stop parking lot. In isolation, those 3 data points belong to 3 different agencies in 3 different states. There is no automatic system that pulls them together. There was no automatic system. That absence is the gap that certain killers found and used for years. When investigators interviewed convicted killers who had operated along highway corridors, a specific phrase came up repeatedly in the documentation. They said some version of the same thing. I never worried about getting caught because I was already gone before morning. That is not arrogance. That is an accurate reading of a real structural weakness. Jurisdiction is the wall that law enforcement built around itself, and that wall protected certain predators for years at the cost of human lives. To understand how the HSKI works, you need to understand VICAP first. The Violent Criminal Apprehension Program is a national database maintained by the FBI. Local agencies can submit unsolved violent crimes to it: murders, attempted murders, disappearances, sexual assaults. The idea is straightforward. A case entered in rural Louisiana might match a case submitted from rural Montana. The database holds the pattern. The analyst reads the pattern. The pattern leads to a suspect. The problem is participation. VICAP is voluntary. In its early years, participation rates were low. Rural sheriff's departments with 2 deputies and a part-time dispatcher were not regularly entering case data into a federal system. They had different immediate priorities. They had resource constraints. They lacked training on how to use the system. And in many cases, they had classified a body found by a roadside as a natural death or an accident and never opened a murder file in the first place. That last part is the critical piece, because it is where this specific case begins. The victims in highway serial killing cases share documented patterns that the FBI has cataloged extensively within the HSKI database. They are disproportionately women. They are disproportionately from vulnerable populations, women experiencing homelessness, women involved in survival sex work, women struggling with addiction. They are often found along highway corridors, near truck stops, near rest areas, or in the drainage ditches and overgrown lots adjacent to commercial transportation infrastructure. And their deaths are disproportionately classified as either accidents, overdoses, or causes undetermined. The reason is not malice from local investigators. The reason is resource allocation and the weight of baseline expectation. When a woman with no fixed address is found dead near a rest stop, the baseline assumption is overdose. The coroner may not have the toxicology budget to test comprehensively. The sheriff's department may not have the bandwidth to open a full homicide investigation. The family, if investigators can locate them, may not have the resources or knowledge to push back against a finding. The case gets filed. The file sits in a cabinet or a database. The killer moves to the next state, and no one connects the file in Cabinet A to the file in Cabinet B 3 states away. The FBI has documented hundreds of cases matching this pattern in the HSKI database. Hundreds of cases, spread across more than 24 states. Victims who have names, families, histories, but no open homicide file. Because the original classification ruled out murder before the investigation had properly begun. When investigators started building the case I'm describing today, they began from a specific geographic cluster that had surfaced through HSKI analysis. A set of cases, not all linked immediately, not all obviously connected, kept appearing within a corridor of highway running through multiple states. The common threads were physical, the manner of injury, the locations relative to documented truck stop routes and way station positions, the profile of the victims. No single agency saw the full picture independently. The HSKI analysts did. They built a timeline. They mapped the corridor. They started pulling commercial vehicle records because the HSKI had introduced commercial vehicle data as a standard investigative tool. Long-haul trucks are not invisible. They generate records. Way station logs in most states require trucks to check in and record their transit. Electronic logging devices, mandatory in commercial trucking since federal motor carrier regulations took effect in the mid-2010s, create an automatic GPS-stamped record of where a truck was and at what time. That mandate changed highway homicide investigation in ways that investigators are still understanding. Before electronic logging was required, a driver's log was a paper document that the driver filled out themselves. Investigators had found falsified logs in multiple cases. Drivers who understood how logs were inspected knew exactly how to make the paper look clean. An electronic logging device removes that option entirely. The device records the location. The device records the time and the speed and the route. The device does not lie, and it cannot be rewritten the next morning. So investigators had a corridor. They had a cluster of cases. They had way station records and electronic logs for more recent trips. They started building a list of commercial drivers whose documented routes overlapped with every location in the cluster. Not some locations, every location. That is a small list. That is always a small list. And that small list is where a real investigation begins. The suspect on this list had no prior convictions, no registered sex offenses, no flags in the standard criminal databases that investigators run first. He had a commercial driver's license in good standing. He had been driving long-haul routes for over a decade. He had a work record that appeared, from the outside, entirely unremarkable. He looked on paper like thousands of other drivers moving freight across the country every week. That is consistent with documented patterns in HSKI cases. The drivers who appear in the initiative's data are not uniformly people with extensive prior criminal histories. Some have none at all. What they have is access, routine, and an operational understanding of how hard it is to connect a body in one state to a truck that passed through a week earlier. Investigators began placing the suspect under indirect surveillance. They tracked his current routes using available electronic records. They pulled his historical way station submissions going back years and started mapping his documented position at specific dates and times. And as the map grew, They began lining it up against the timeline of cases in the HSKI cluster. The overlap was not coincidental, it was systematic. But overlap is not conviction. Overlap is not even probable cause for an arrest. Overlap gets you a search warrant if the other elements are in place. It does not get you to trial by itself. Investigators needed something harder. They needed to place him at a specific location at a specific time, a location he would have no documented operational reason to be in, a location that corresponded directly to one of the cases in the cluster. And they needed him to lie about that location on the record. Because the lie, placed against a document he didn't know existed, becomes the brick in the wall. Here is where the parking ticket comes in. The last case in the cluster, the one with the clearest forensic profile and the most recoverable physical evidence, had occurred in a mid-sized city along the highway corridor. The victim was last seen near a truck stop on the industrial edge of town. There was a commercial parking lot 2 blocks from that truck stop. A truck had parked there overnight. A municipal code enforcement officer, working a routine enforcement shift, had issued a parking violation early that morning. The ticket was logged into the city's parking management system along with the vehicle's plate number. $12, standard infraction. No one thought about it again. That plate matched the suspect's truck. When investigators interviewed him, they asked about that city directly. He denied ever being there. He was specific about it. That city was not on his route. He had no freight pickups or deliveries that would take him there. He had never been to that city. He was not there on the night in question. The parking ticket was in the database. The plate was in the database. The date was in the database. He had been there. He had been there, 2 blocks from where the victim was last seen, on the exact night in question. His truck had sat in that lot long enough for a code enforcement officer to walk past it and write a ticket before sunrise. That denial, placed against a $12 municipal parking record, was the thread that unraveled the entire construction he had built around himself. Investigators went back through every record available. They pulled toll transponder data. They pulled fuel card receipts, because commercial drivers on company accounts generate itemized fuel purchase records with timestamps and locations. They cross-referenced those records against the full list of cases in the cluster. They found he had been in locations he denied being in, on dates that matched the case timeline, in cities he said he had never visited. Every denial collapsed against a document. Every alibi dissolved when investigators checked the record it depended on. Investigators use a phrase for this kind of evidence architecture. They call it building a box. You place one document at a time. You let the suspect generate denials, and then you place the document that contradicts each denial. When the box is complete, there is no exit. Every direction the suspect moves runs into a record that says he was there, at that time, doing what he said he wasn't doing. The search of his vehicle and his property produced additional physical evidence that investigators had not fully anticipated. The case that had started as a cluster of unrelated files spread across 8 states became a documented prosecution with a clear evidentiary chain. The families of the victims had been waiting years. Some had been told their daughters died of overdoses. Some had been told the cause of death was undetermined. Some had never received a phone call from any law enforcement agency at all. When investigators began the process of notifying families, they described the same experience. A phone call arriving years after the fact. A voice on the line telling them that the death of someone they loved had not been what they were told. That the system had failed to connect the evidence. That the records existed but had not been assembled into a picture until now. That is the institutional failure at the center of this story, not the killer's methods. The structure of the system that allowed him to operate. The HSKI has made documented and measurable progress since it launched in 2004. The number of unsolved cases submitted to the database has grown substantially as more agencies have participated. The integration of electronic logging device data has given investigators a tool that simply did not exist in earlier years. The number of suspects identified through cross-referencing commercial vehicle records against case timelines has increased every year the program has run. But the foundational problems that allowed cases like this one to develop over years have not been fully resolved. Rural and under-resourced law enforcement agencies still lack the staffing and budget to enter case data systematically into federal databases. Coroners in jurisdictions without full forensic pathology infrastructure still classify ambiguous deaths without comprehensive toxicology. Families of victims from marginalized populations still encounter a system that does not always respond with the same urgency or resources it deploys for other cases. The FBI's own documentation on the HSKI acknowledges this directly. The program's published materials note that the majority of victims in highway serial killing cases were engaged in high-risk activities at the time of their deaths. That is clinical language. Underneath it is a population of vulnerable people: women without stable housing, women in survival situations, women trying to get from one place to another on a highway that did not care whether they arrived. They were not protected by the system the way other people are protected by the system, and certain predators knew that. They counted on it. Researchers and advocates working on highway homicide cases have pushed for mandatory VICAP participation requirements, for standardized cause of death protocols applied to deaths occurring near highway infrastructure and truck stop corridors, for dedicated cold case investigators in states with high volumes of unclassified female deaths near major transportation arteries. Some states have moved in that direction. Many have not, because the resources required are real and the political will to allocate them is inconsistent. The reforms that followed cases documented through the HSKI include improved data sharing protocols between state and federal agencies, expanded use of electronic records from commercial vehicles in highway crime investigations, updated training materials for rural and regional investigators on recognizing indicators of potential highway homicide patterns. Several states revised their reporting requirements for deaths occurring near highway infrastructure. These are real changes. They are also incremental changes in response to failures that cost real lives over years. If you have been watching this channel and you have not subscribed yet, do it now. The next case I'm covering involves evidence that was correctly identified at the scene, correctly collected by investigators, and then sat unexamined in a lab queue for 11 years while the killer kept moving. That case is harder than this one. This one was already hard enough. A $12 parking ticket caught the man who killed across 8 states. That is the documented fact. The other documented fact, sitting directly behind it, is that dozens of agencies, hundreds of reports, years of case files, and an entire national database all failed to catch him before that ticket was issued. The parking ticket did not represent an advance in investigative capability. It represented the accidental survival of a single piece of paper in a system that was never specifically designed to look for it. The victims in this case had names. They had families who were told a version of events that was incomplete or wrong. They waited years for a phone call that most of them never expected to receive. When it came because a parking ticket sat in a municipal database long enough for investigators to finally think to look. The killer is in prison. The structural failures that allowed him to operate across 8 states for years are still being addressed, slowly, against the resistance of budget constraints, training gaps, and institutional inertia in agencies that have more immediate demands on their limited resources. That is where the story actually ends, not with the arrest, with the ongoing work required to ensure that the next cluster of deaths along the next highway corridor gets connected before the years pile up and families wait by phones that don't ring. I'm Danny Cruz. The documents don't lie. The systems built around them sometimes fail badly. I'll be back with the next case.